"Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He adjusted his hat. "Because in Texas, we don't chain folks who've surrendered. March 1945. The Texas sun beat down on the red clay road leading into Camp Hearn. A truck rumbled to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air. Inside the flatbed, 20 German women sat in silence, their wrists bound with dull steel cuffs that clinked softly with every bump in the road. Elsa Keller, 24 years old, a former clerk for the Luftwaffe, sat among them. Her eyes were hollow from weeks of transport across an ocean and through the empty plains of America. The last she'd heard of Germany had come through a soldier's rumor. Berlin burning, the Reich collapsing, her family swallowed by chaos. She had no illusions left. She expected humiliation, perhaps worse. When the tailgate dropped, armed guards stood waiting. But something was strange. The men weren't shouting. They weren't even glaring. One of them, tall and sunburned, wore not a helmet, but a broad cowboy hat. His rifle hung loosely at his shoulder, his stance casual, almost polite. Elsa froze as he approached, his boots crunched against the gravel, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she braced for the worst. A strike, an insult, some confirmation that the enemy she'd been taught to fear was real. Instead, he stopped in front of her and nodded once. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you don't need these here." Before she could react, he pulled a key from his pocket and slipped it into the lock around her wrists. The shackle clicked, and the chain fell away, landing in the dirt with a dull, heavy thud. The sound cut through the air like a gunshot. Every head turned. The camp yard went silent. Elsa stared at her hands, pale, bruised, trembling. She didn't move. Couldn't. For the first time since capture, she wasn't restrained. She looked up at the cowboy, confusion written across her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He adjusted his hat. "Because in Texas," he said simply, "we don't chain folks who've surrendered." No one spoke. Even the guards standing nearby seemed to pause, as if realizing that something irreversible had just happened. The other prisoners watched, eyes wide with disbelief. Some blinked in anger, others in shock. Elsa rubbed her wrists. The metal had left faint red circles, small, almost meaningless, and yet in that moment they felt like scars healing in real time. She wanted to thank him, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she gave a stiff nod and stepped forward. As she walked past the cowboy, the faint jingle of her fallen chain echoed behind her, the sound of everything she'd been taught about enemies collapsing into dust. By nightfall, every woman in the barracks had heard the story. The American cowboy who unchained a German prisoner. Some whispered it in disbelief, others in awe, but all of them felt the same chill of realization. The war was still raging across oceans and continents. But in that quiet Texas camp, something else had begun to fall apart. The idea that mercy was weakness. Before capture, Elsa had believed one thing with absolute certainty, that falling into American hands was a death sentence. The posters back home showed Allied soldiers as savages, grinning behind barbed wire, standing over the beaten bodies of German prisoners. Women were told they would be abused, paraded, or worse. She'd spent the long voyage across the Atlantic, clutching those warnings like armor, waiting for the inevitable cruelty. Now, as she lay on a clean bunk with a blanket that smelled faintly of soap, that armor began to crack. The guards spoke politely, even awkwardly. Meals arrived on time. The food was warm, bread, beans, coffee, simple, but real. The first night when Elsa hesitated to eat, one of the guards shrugged and said, "It's the same thing we get, ma'am." That night she lay awake, listening to the soft hum of insects outside and the distant sound of laughter from the guardhouse. The laughter disturbed her more than any shouting would have. It didn't fit the enemy she'd been told to hate. The next morning, she tried to look for the cruelty she'd been promised. She studied the guards' faces, waiting for one of them to sneer, to remind her of her place. None did. One even tipped his hat as he passed. Later that day, an American officer visited the women's barracks to explain the camp rules. He spoke through an interpreter, but his tone was clear. Calm, measured, firm. You will work. You will be fed. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Anyone who mistreats you answers to me. The interpreter's voice trembled slightly as she repeated the words in German. Elsa could see disbelief ripple through the group. One of the older women, a nurse from Bremen, whispered, "They're lying. They always lie." Elsa wasn't so sure anymore. That afternoon, she caught sight of the cowboy again, the same man who had unchained her. He was sitting on the fence, cleaning his rifle, his hat tipped back. She stared at him for a long moment before asking, "Why did you do it? Why remove my chains?" He looked up. "Because a chain don't make anyone safer," he said, "only meaner." It was a strange kind of wisdom, the sort that sounded like something a grandfather might say, but it hit her harder than any sermon. The next day, she wrote her first diary entry in months. "The Americans are strange," she wrote. "They smile too much, they speak softly, and they give their prisoners coffee. I don't know what to make of them. I keep waiting for the cruelty to begin, but it never comes. Maybe that is their cruelty, that they make us question everything we believed." By the end of the week, the fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer fear of what the Americans might do to them. It was fear of what this kindness might reveal about themselves. By the spring of 1945, the United States held over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war. Of those, more than 85,000 were scattered across Texas, a state whose vast land and mild winters made it ideal for large encampments. Barbed wire fences stretched across empty plains, once meant for cattle. Wooden guard towers rose over fields that now held men and women who had once sworn allegiance to the Reich. The American POW system was not an improvisation. It was a carefully structured machine of order and restraint, guided by the 1929 Geneva Convention. Every camp followed a strict code. Prisoners were entitled to shelter, medical care, fair rations, religious services, and mail. Each received pay for their labor, access to education, and remarkably, the right to complain formally if mistreated. To Elsa, this was unthinkable. Back home, Allied captives often vanished without trace. Here, prisoners wrote letters, played chess, painted murals, even joined orchestras organized by the Red Cross. The camp's commandant, Colonel Thomas Whitaker, had been a lawyer before the war. He told his men that America's treatment of prisoners was a reflection of what we fight for. To him, dignity was not charity. It was proof that the United States could uphold its ideals even in the shadow of its enemies. In Texas, that philosophy came alive through cowboys, clerks, and soldiers who had never seen Europe but carried a quiet code of fairness older than the war itself. They didn't see prisoners as monsters, just people caught on the wrong side of a vast storm. Each morning, the German women were assigned light duties: laundry, sewing, food preparation. They earned small wages redeemable for cigarettes, soap, or writing paper. Red Cross volunteers visited weekly, ensuring supplies met the international standard. The camp even had a small library with English and German books. The U.S. Army's War Department had calculated that humane treatment wasn't just moral, it was practical. Word of fair conditions in American camps would filter back to the front, encouraging Axis soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Every kind gesture was a quiet weapon, striking not with bullets, but with disbelief. Elsa began to notice the logic in the order. Even the smallest things, the exact portions of food, the timing of mail delivery, the sanitation checks, spoke of an efficiency that was both comforting and unnerving. Germany had run on command and fear. America ran on procedure and trust. One afternoon, she overheard two American guards talking while repairing a fence. One said, "You know, these folks will go home and tell everyone we treated them right." The other laughed. "Maybe that's the best propaganda we got." That night, Elsa couldn't sleep. The phrase repeated in her mind, the best propaganda. Could kindness be a weapon? Could decency be deliberate? Weeks passed and the rhythm of camp life became familiar. Work, meals, lights out at 9. Each day chipped away a little more of the old certainties she had carried across the ocean. She had been raised to believe that strength came from fear and that mercy was a sign of weakness. Yet here, surrounded by enemies who smiled as they handed her food, she began to wonder if she had misunderstood everything about power. In her diary she wrote, "The Americans have no whip, no shouts, No threats, yet we obey. Perhaps that is true control, when order comes not from fear, but from choice. The walls of the camp were made of wire, but inside them she began to glimpse a freedom she had never known in Germany. The longer Elsa spent in the camp, the more she noticed the strange arithmetic of American life, a balance sheet of power that measured strength not only in guns and tanks, but in how they treated even their enemies. Every week, the guards received newspapers. Most of the POWs couldn't read English, but Elsa had studied languages before the war and began to decipher headlines. That's how she first saw the number that shook her more than any explosion ever could. 96,000 airplanes, built in 1944. She read it twice to make sure it wasn't a mistake. 96,000. In Germany, the Luftwaffe factories had been running on desperation. Starving workers, recycled materials, sabotage, air raids. Yet America had managed to flood the skies with machines faster than anyone could shoot them down. Another number came a week later, 425,000 prisoners of war housed in the United States. She realized she was just one name in that massive count. It wasn't just that America had defeated Germany, it had absorbed its enemies completely, feeding and sheltering them like an extension of its own people. One evening, while working in the camp kitchen, Elsa saw an American sergeant weighing sacks of flour. She asked him through the translator how much food the camp used in a day. He smiled and showed her the ledger. 2,000 pounds of flour, 800 pounds of meat, 500 gallons of milk. "And that's just for you folks," he said, tapping the page. Elsa froze. "You spend all this on prisoners?" And the sergeant shrugged. "You're human, ain't you? We feed humans." She carried that sentence with her all night. Back home, even German civilians were starving. Her younger brother had written in his last letter from Hamburg that children were boiling wallpaper glue for soup. Yet here in the land of her enemies, she ate better than her family did in the fatherland. It didn't make sense. Or perhaps it made too much sense. The next morning, she saw the cowboy again, the same one who had unlocked her chains. He was repairing a fence post near the women's compound. She approached hesitantly, holding a ledger page she'd copied by hand. "Why so much food for us?" she asked. He glanced at the page, then at her. "You fight a war, right?" he said. "Don't mean you got to lose your soul doing it." She didn't answer, but something inside her cracked open. That night she calculated the value of what she'd eaten that week. Flour, butter, coffee, meat. The numbers stunned her. If she'd sold those rations on the black market in Germany, she could have fed an entire street for a month. She wrote in her diary, "If mercy has a price, the Americans pay it gladly. If power has a cost, they call it decency." When she shared her thoughts with another woman, an older nurse named Greta, the woman shook her head. "Don't let it fool you. It's just a show." Elsa wasn't sure anymore. The numbers didn't lie. The food didn't lie. The smiles didn't lie. Germany had built its empire on fear, control, and scarcity. America had built its victory on abundance, the quiet, unrelenting belief that kindness was a force multiplier. As she lay in her bunk, listening to the hum of the generator outside, Elsa realized that the most dangerous thing about America wasn't its weapons. It was that its generosity made hate feel ridiculous. The work assignments changed that week. The women were sent beyond the camp fences to help with field labor, mostly harvesting cotton and tending livestock under the supervision of local ranchers. For the first time, they saw real Texas countryside. Endless stretches of sun-baked grass, slow-moving cattle, the smell of earth and sweat instead of gunpowder and ash. When the truck stopped at a nearby ranch, Elsa stepped down and squinted against the sunlight. The cowboys stood waiting, their hats tilted low, ropes slung over their shoulders. They looked nothing like the soldiers she had known. They moved slower, smiled more, spoke with a rhythm that was both alien and calming. One of the women, Greta, whispered under her breath in German, "Look at them. These farmers think they won the war." Another woman laughed. "They're cowboys, not soldiers. They probably think they can lasso Hitler next." The mockery spread quietly among them, a defense mechanism more than cruelty. Humor was their last weapon, and they used it like a shield. Elsa laughed too, though it sounded hollow. The cowboy in charge, a tall man named Clint Dawson, heard their laughter. but said nothing. He led them to a fenced paddock and pointed to the saddled horses. "You all going to help us move the herd down by the stream? Don't worry, the horses are gentle." The laughter stopped. None of the women moved. Greta stared at him. "You expect prisoners to ride?" she asked, her voice tense. Clint raised an eyebrow. "You'd rather walk?" The absurdity of it all left them speechless. Prisoners on horseback. It sounded like a cruel joke. Yet the horses stood there, tails swishing lazily, waiting. After a long silence, Elsa stepped forward. She had ridden as a girl before the war, a few lessons on a borrowed horse outside Munich. She climbed onto the saddle, awkward but determined. Clint adjusted the reins, careful not to touch her hands. "Hold firm," he said. "Horse will trust you if you trust her." Greta muttered in German, "You're playing their game." But when the horse began to move, Elsa felt something she hadn't felt in years. Balance, freedom. The motion was unfamiliar yet instinctive, and for a brief moment she forgot the barbed wire, the uniforms, the humiliation. As they rode across the field, the cowboys gave instructions with calm precision, never shouting, never ordering. One even joked, "You ride better than my cousin." The women smiled despite themselves. Later at lunch, the POWs were given sandwiches, fruit, and cold water. The cowboys sat beside them, eating the same food. No guard shouted. No one drew a line in the dirt to separate them. It was too much for Greta. "This is theater," she snapped quietly to Elsa. "They want us to forget we're prisoners." Elsa looked around. The sun was hot, the wind was soft, and laughter drifted up again from the men who were supposed to be their enemies. "Maybe forgetting isn't the worst thing," she said. That afternoon, when they returned to camp, the women were quieter. The jokes had faded. Something had shifted, subtly but permanently. In her diary, Elsa wrote that night, "We mocked them for their simplicity, but now I wonder if it is simplicity or wisdom. They treat us as equals, not to humiliate us, but to remind us what being human feels like. For the first time, I feel ashamed. Not of being captured, but of having believed that kindness was weakness." The next morning, when the trucks returned to take them out again, no one laughed. They climbed aboard silently, their pride cracking under the weight of decency. That night, Elsa couldn't sleep. Her body was sore from riding, but her mind was restless. She replayed every moment, the calm voices, the cowboys' steady hands, the sound of wind through the open plains. She had grown up believing that enemies were to be feared, hated, or at least despised. But these men had given her none of that. They had given her horses, bread, and laughter, and somehow that felt far more dangerous. She began to measure what she saw, the way she'd once tallied rations in her family's kitchen during the war. The math made no sense. How could a nation spend this much on people who had tried to destroy it? She remembered the guard who mentioned the U.S. War Department's expenditures, over $1.8 billion spent to feed, house, and care for Axis prisoners of war. That was more than Germany had spent feeding its own army in the same year. America was winning a different kind of war, one that didn't depend on bullets or fear, but on principles. While Europe drowned in hatred, this strange, loud, vast country treated its captives with dignity. Not because it had to, but because it chose to. At breakfast the next morning, Elsa stared at her plate. Eggs, toast, a cup of coffee. Across from her, Greta muttered, "This is obscene. They feed us like kings while our people starve." Elsa's fork paused midair. "Then why does it make me want to cry?" Greta frowned. "Because you're forgetting who you are." But that wasn't it. Elsa wasn't forgetting. She was remembering. Remembering what life was before the uniforms, before the indoctrination, before the fear of speaking the wrong word. She realized that what broke her wasn't defeat in war. It was the proof that the enemy she'd been told was barbaric was, in truth, more civilized than her own leaders had ever been. Later that afternoon, while washing linens with other prisoners, she overheard an American soldier talking about the camp budget. "We could have spent less," he said, "but the colonel says how we treat them says more about us than it does about them." That night, Elsa wrote in her diary, "They defeated us without a single insult, just food." The words didn't feel poetic. They felt like confession. She began to see how numbers could be moral, dollars into decency, meals into mercy. Each act of generosity was a line item in an invisible ledger, and every smile, every meal, every small act of fairness was America's investment in a peace she didn't yet understand. Days turned into weeks, and the camp's routine became a quiet rhythm. Each small kindness chipped away at what remained of her arrogance. She started to greet the guards with a nod, to thank the kitchen staff. It was unnatural at first, gratitude toward enemies, but it grew easier each day. One evening she saw the cowboy again. He stood by the fence, hat tilted, watching the sunset. She wanted to speak but couldn't. Her throat ached with something she couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or realization. For the first time in her life, Elsa understood that pride could starve a person just as much as hunger. And mercy, she thought, could feed even those who didn't deserve it. That night, she wrote a final line before turning out the light. They conquered our land with machines, but they conquered our hearts with decency. The Red Cross truck arrived once a month, bringing supplies, soap, and the small miracle that every prisoner waited for: paper, envelopes, and postage letters. For some, it was the only proof that they still existed. For others, it was the only way to speak freely, even if they had to hide their truth between the lines. Elsa sat at a wooden table in the camp's recreation hall, pencil in hand, staring at the blank page. Around her, other women wrote mechanically, "I am healthy. The food is sufficient. We are treated well." These were the safe phrases, the expected ones. The censors would let them pass without question, but Elsa wanted to write more. She began slowly. "Dearest Mother, I am alive. I am in Texas, a place with more sky than I thought the world could hold." She paused, then added, "The people here are strange. They smile too easily, even the soldiers." Her hand trembled. She wasn't supposed to write what she truly felt, that her captors were kind, that she was fed better than ever before, that she had ridden a horse through a field of sunflowers and forgotten for one moment that she was a prisoner. But the words came anyway. "Mother, I don't know how to explain this country. They feed us meat every day, coffee in the morning, and bread that tastes like home. We help on ranches, not as slaves, but as workers. They call us ma'am, even though they know who we are. Sometimes I think they've already forgiven us, and that's harder to bear than hatred." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the collection pile. She didn't know if it would pass the censors or if her mother would ever see it, but the act of writing it made her feel lighter, almost free. Weeks later, she received a reply, a trembling note written in pencil, smuggled through the ruins of Hamburg. "My dearest Elsa, I am relieved you are alive. Your words sound impossible. You say the Americans are kind. They are the enemy. But maybe I am the fool. Perhaps we were all fools." Her mother's letter ended with one haunting line. "If what you say is true, then perhaps we were never the strong ones after all." Word of Elsa's letter began to spread among the women. Soon others started writing similar ones, describing the cowboys, the food, the decency that seemed almost unbearable. One woman wrote to her husband on the Eastern Front, "We are treated better here than you will ever be at home." Months later, Red Cross records confirmed what no one had expected. Letters from POW camps in America were circulating in Germany, whispered about in bomb shelters, passed between neighbors in secret. They were small but powerful contraband, carrying a truth that the Reich could never control. Elsa didn't know it then, but her words had become part of that underground current. Stories of a kindness leaking into a country built on fear. It was the quietest rebellion of the war, carried not by soldiers but by envelopes, ink, and the courage to tell the truth. That night she wrote again, "Mother, I used to believe power was about who could command and who could obey. But now I see power in something else, in the man who could hate me but chooses not to." As she sealed the letter, a tear dropped onto the page, smudging the ink. For the first time in years, she didn't wipe it away. It had been nearly a month since Elsa last saw the cowboy named Clint Dawson. The work assignments had changed, and the women were now mostly sewing uniforms and cleaning tools instead of going out to the fields. Life in camp had become steady, predictable, a strange kind of peace that felt both comforting and disorienting. Then, One crisp autumn morning, a familiar pickup truck rolled up to the gates. The guards exchanged a few quiet words, and soon Clint appeared, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. The women paused their chores to watch. His boots crunched against the gravel, his hat tilted low, the same easy gait as always. He approached the fence and called out, "Got something for you, ladies." The guards looked uneasy. Gifts weren't part of protocol, but Clint wasn't exactly the kind of man who cared much for protocol. He set the package on a wooden crate and unwrapped it, revealing a jar of homemade peach preserves, sealed tight and gleaming golden in the morning light. Elsa stepped closer, hands gripping the fence. "Why are you bringing us this?" she asked, suspicion mixing with confusion. Clint shrugged. "Because you worked hard. Because you deserve something sweet. War is nearly over anyway." The words hit her harder than she expected. She hadn't allowed herself to think about the war ending, what it would mean, what she would return to. She just stared at him, unable to speak. One of the guards muttered, "You can't hand things through, Dawson. Rules are rules." Clint smiled faintly. "Then I reckon you better take it, Sergeant. Say it came from the wind." The guard rolled his eyes but took the jar, setting it near the kitchen tent where the women would find it later. Before he left, Clint tipped his hat. "You all hang in there. Texas ain't such a bad place to be stuck." Elsa's throat tightened. Without thinking, she reached a hand through the fence, not to ask for anything, just to gesture thanks. Clint looked at her hand for a moment, then grasped it firmly. The handshake was quick, quiet, human. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched an American, and it was enough. That night, the women shared the peach preserves at dinner, just a spoonful each, spread thinly over bread. The taste was warm, rich, and painfully gentle. Greta whispered, "He could have ignored us. Instead, he gave us this." Elsa nodded slowly. "He gave us more than food. He gave us the proof that kindness isn't weakness." As they ate, the guard said nothing. The camp was silent except for the distant howl of wind across the prairie and the soft clinking of tin spoons. Later, lying in her bunk, Elsa thought about that handshake. It had lasted less than a second, but it felt like the end of something much larger. The end of hate, the end of propaganda, the end of the belief that enemies could only destroy, never understand. She wrote one last letter that night. "There is a man here who does not know me, yet he treated me as though I mattered. Perhaps that is the beginning of peace. When someone sees you not as a flag or a uniform, but as a soul." When she finished, she folded the paper, sealed it, and smiled faintly. Somewhere outside the camp, the cowboy was probably back on his ranch, watching the sunset, unaware that his simple kindness had done what entire governments could not. It had made peace real. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. The radio in the guardhouse played the news every day. Berlin surrounded, Hitler missing, the Reich collapsing. The camp, once filled with fear and silence, now buzzed with a strange anticipation. Every prisoner knew something irreversible was coming. Freedom, perhaps, or something harder to define. For Elsa, it came quietly. On a warm May afternoon, she was handed a sheet of paper from the camp commandant. "Germany has surrendered," he said simply. No speeches, no ceremony, just those words. Around her, women gasped. Some fell to their knees, others wept openly. A few laughed bitterly. Greta whispered, "So it's true. We lost." Elsa looked down at the dirt beneath her feet. "Maybe," she murmured, "or maybe we finally won something worth keeping." That evening, she sat on the steps of the barracks, watching the American guards dismantle the watchtowers. The barbed wire would come down next. The fences that had defined her world were being rolled up like old rope, and yet she felt no triumph, no bitterness, only a deep, hollow peace. Later, she opened her small notebook, the one she had kept hidden since the day she arrived. Its pages were filled with fragments of thoughts, confessions, quiet realizations. At the bottom of the final page, she wrote one last entry. "They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out the fools were us." She closed the notebook and smiled faintly. The truth of it was too large to put into words. The Americans had not defeated them with weapons or even numbers. They had defeated them with something infinitely more dangerous, dignity. Weeks later, the camp was closed. Trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to processing centers before repatriation. Elsa and the other women stood in line as the guards handed back small belongings: a handkerchief, a photograph, a comb. When Clint Dawson appeared one last time, he didn't speak. He simply tipped his hat. Elsa stepped forward, hesitated, then handed him her notebook. "For you," she said softly. "You taught me something no war ever could." Clint looked confused. "What's that?" "That mercy," she said, "can be stronger than fear." He nodded, eyes lowered. "Safe travels, Mom." As the truck rumbled away, Elsa looked out over the Texas plains. The camp shrank behind her until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the horizon. But the lessons she carried from that place of kindness, fairness, humanity would never fade. Years later, she would tell her grandchildren in a rebuilt Germany about the cowboys of Texas, about how they treated her not as an enemy, but as a person, about the day she rode a horse for the first time and realized that freedom wasn't about borders, it was about spirit. And in that retelling, the war didn't sound like defeat, it sounded like awakening. History would remember nations by their victories and losses, but those who lived it, Elsa thought, remembered something else: the faces of their captors who refused to be cruel, the meals that proved compassion could rebuild what hatred had destroyed. The Americans had shown her that power without mercy was emptiness, and mercy once given could never truly be taken back. The war ended, but the memory never did. Years later, Elsa would return to Texas as an old woman. The camp was gone, replaced by a field of grass and wind. Nothing left but the faint outline of where the barracks once stood. Yet, as she stood there, she could almost hear the distant laughter of the cowboys, the clatter of tin plates, and the soft rustle of horses in the dusk. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We thought we knew what power was. We thought cruelty made us strong, but it was kindness that won." Nearby, a young ranch hand saw her standing alone and asked, "Ma'am, were you one of the prisoners?" Elsa smiled. "Yes, but not anymore." In that moment, she realized the truth that had taken her a lifetime to understand, that the line between enemy and friend was as thin as a fence wire and just as easy to remove. Her story would never make it into textbooks or grand speeches, but it lived on in the quiet hearts of those who learned that mercy can end a war faster than any bullet. As the sun dipped below the Texas horizon, she said the words that defined her life. "They defeated us without hate, and in doing so, they saved us."